G'day, mate. 40 here. Such a dramatic contrast between the two campaigns with Donald Trump and, in particular, J.D. Vance, eager to take on all comers. I mean, J.D. Vance is all over media that is quite hostile to him. Donald Trump is doing interview after interview, but I don't think Kamala Harris is going to do another interview before the debate, perhaps not another independent interview before the election, because she just does not do too well. Right, here is Hugh Hewitt talking with conservative political reporter Byron York.
And going. Or will the CNN interview, which you just made a quick reference to, which was not confidence-inspiring, will that start the beginning of a time in which the more people hear from her, the less confidence they have in her? So we'll have to see, but I think that's where things stand now.
I will play at the bottom of the hour the entire interview I had with Trey Gowdy on Sunday night, in which I stated very plainly, I don't believe Kamala Harris has the minimum skill set necessary to be president. And I borrowed then, and I'll borrow again from Abe Greenwald, the executive editor of Commentary. Interviews are her kryptonite. It was not only not inspiring, and I'm just being blunt, it was a softball interview, and she failed to hit the softball. What do you think of that interview, Byron?
It was. It was interesting. It was, I would call it a mostly friendly interview, very few follow-up questions. And you didn't see the kind of follow-up questions that a reporter asks when they're really trying to dig into a question, like, why did you change your position on this? But you said this, and then you said this, said this. Why have you changed that? You just didn't see any of that. As a matter of fact, CNN interviewed Tulsi Gabbard, who, of course, has endorsed Trump. Same reporter, Dana Bash, interviewed Gabbard, asked a lot more questions, did a lot more probing interview of Tulsi Gabbard than she did of Kamala Harris. So, I mean, it counts as an interview. It was only, 27 minutes total of Q&A, which is not a whole lot. But my question is she going to do any more? Obviously, it didn't go well for her, and if she does it again and again and again, it could increase the risk of her just saying something that really damages her campaign. So is she going to do it again? I don't know. She could certainly say right now, the debate is, a week today. Not going to do anything before that. And then after that, you're in the final sprint. She's not. So I don't know if she's going to do another interview before the election.
She's only going to do it if she's lost any chance of winning. That's what my estimate is. Let me play for you Kamala in Detroit yesterday, cut number 17.
You better thank a union member. Union member for sick leave. You better thank a union member for paid leave. You better thank a union member for vacation time.
5 hours later in Pittsburgh, cut number 18.
But you better thank unions for that 5-day work week. Thank unions for sick leave. Thank unions for paid family.
Okay, I think this is really weak and common conservative critiques. So I have a lot of disgust with the overall intellectual quality of right-wing media. Code switching is natural, normal, human, and often healthy, right? You speak differently to your lover than you do to your parents, than you do to your boss, to your clients. Right? Kamala Harris is simply engaging in code switching here, right? Speaking in Ebonics in Detroit and speaking differently in a different place. So I don't consider that disqualifying. Barack Obama sometimes would deliberately speak with a black accent, and other times he'd sound white.
Thank unions for your vacation time.
What happened to her in the 5 hours? Did she get hit on the head?
I was actually listening to that one, the first one, the Detroit one, and I was kind of amazed. I mean, it was, I heard you ask David Drucker, have you ever heard that before? I'd never heard it before from her. This obviously was kind of a black preacher thing, and she's not a preacher, but I didn't know what to make of it. And then when she did say, she said essentially the same thing in both speeches.
It's called code switching. It's not that complicated, right? We all do it.
And she delivered them in far different styles. And what she was saying was, just Democratic Party boilerplate. But the way she said it did really strike me. And I think if she does stuff like that in the future, in the next 60-something days, she could be the subject of real ridicule for that.
Well, I think she already is. Byron, again, I'm going to borrow from the Commentary podcast. Christine Rosen of
Yeah, when I was a kid, we would sometimes mock out our classmates because they would speak differently to their parents than they spoke to us. Right? It's easy to mock someone for code switching, but code switching is no more natural and healthy.
AI said that Kamala Harris suffers from imposter syndrome generated insecurity. that she just doesn't think she should be in this position. She'd never want to vote. That landed with me because I don't think she thinks she can do this job. Do you think that that's showing through?
Well, she's been, I think everybody before the Democratic Party turned on a dime on July 22nd and acclaimed her by the presidential candidate. I think there was almost a consensus that she had not performed very well as vice president, that she had not accomplished anything, even when given the opportunity to do so. She had run a very chaotic and angry and divided office. I mean, people leave her employment in droves, and that she had not made any mark as vice president. And if you remember, back in those long ago days, a couple months ago, there was a lot of debate about if Joe Biden were to pull out of the race or couldn't continue, who would be the presidential candidate. And there were a large number of Democrats who did not think it should be Kamala Harris for the very reason that you just said. She really couldn't be president.
It involves what George W. Bush called being the decider-in-chief, and I don't think she has the ability to do that. Byron, let's close by talking about the catastrophe in the tunnels of Gaza. On Thursday night, in a little noted part of the interview, Dana Bash asked the vice president.
Okay, let's go to Bret Baier talking about the forthcoming debate.
With him, I just don't think Kamala Harris has the minimum skill set necessary to be the president of the United States. Do you think that maybe the high watermark of her candidacy was the moment before she sat down with Dana Bash?
Morning, Hugh. I think the CNN interview did not help, and it does not seem like it is, I don't think it's crashing her polls, but it's also not increasing her polls, and I think that there is this leveling off, and even we're starting to see some drop in some of the swing states. I really think the moment is going to be September 10th and how that all goes on the debate, the ABC debate, and whether there is a second debate. We hope there is. And as I told you, we're trying to negotiate to be considered for that one. Anyway, I do think that interview, did not help her at all and may have hurt her.
I agree with you, and I think there should be a second debate, and I think you ought to moderate it because you're fair, and I just think she's going to sink quickly because of these two bits of tape. This was from yesterday. Kamala Harris, number 1 in Detroit. Kamala Harris, number 2 in Pittsburgh. Let's play 17 first for Bret.
You better thank a union member for the 5-day work week. You better thank a union member for sick leave. You better thank a union member for paid leave. You better thank a union member for vacation time.
Cut number 18.
But you better thank unions for that 5-day work week. Thank unions for sick leave. Thank unions for paid family leave. Thank unions for your vacation time.
So, Bret, aside from the union pitch, does the change in accent get through to any Americans as significant?
I think it makes people mad. I really do. I think if you ask in many polls what's most important, sometimes through the polls, like reading between the lines, it's authenticity. Authenticity is often the thing that I know where this person stands, and when they say something, I think that they're saying what they mean. This made people mad in the Hillary Clinton race when she went to black churches and put on a really thick Southern accent. It made people mad. And I don't know how that affects polls, but I do know that authenticity is a big factor in elections.
Now, the state I'm probably most widely heard in, other than New Hampshire, where I blanket the state, is Pennsylvania, from Scranton and Wilkes-Barre to Philadelphia to Pittsburgh to Erie. I'm all over the Keystone State. Do you think voters in Pennsylvania believe her answer on fracking to Dana Bash?
I think it's confusing. When you say your values have not changed, but your policy has changed 180 degrees, that's confusing. And she said she explained it on the debate stage in 2020. But if you look at that debate stage and what exactly she said with Mike Pence, she said Joe Biden would not ban fracking. She didn't say Kamala Harris has changed her position and won't ban fracking. And I do think it's confusing, and I think that it's a vulnerability.
You are the second person to make that point this morning. Selena Zito was on last hour, and she said she has never spoken in her own voice about fracking, and that does not fly in Pennsylvania. And I think while they hope to put Georgia and North Carolina into play, I'm skeptical of that, but I'm also very skeptical of her reach in Pennsylvania. Now, Fox News has a good polling effort underway. What do those numbers say about Pennsylvania right now?
Right now, it's tight, but I think there is a 2-point spread for the former president in Pennsylvania. And we're seeing, a match of 1-2 points all over the swing states, but it is just in recent days trended a little bit more towards the former president. I mean, right after the announcement of the switch, there was, across the board 2-point maybe lead for Vice President Harris, but that has shifted in recent days. So that's where I guess the air out of the balloon theory is coming from, and let alone Nate Silver, who's now at 11 points or something for the Electoral College towards the former president.
No, I have followed very closely the Arlington National Cemetery controversy because I am familiar with the individual who is helping the Gold Star families put their message out. I have talked to Senator Cotton about it on the air. I think it's a Streisand effect moment that Team Kamala should never have called attention to this because, boy, did they get a right hook to the jaw from those families this weekend, Bret. Do you think most of America knows that?
Somebody on social media following, I think, knows it. And I think that some of those statements from those family members were devastating. I think, I understand the following the process and the rules and the law, but when the comeback from the family is, you never called me, you never talked to me, you never reached out to me after my son died, and it was your policy that killed him. That's tough.
Now, Bret, I know you don't criticize colleagues. I don't either. But I want to know how you would prepare to interview someone about that incident, because my friend Kristen Welker made a serious misstatement with Tom Cotton when she said the vice president was at the dignified return of remains ceremony with Joe Biden. And she corrected herself, which is appropriate and professional. Yeah. And so she does do on air in the same hour. Would you have been prepared to answer that? Because, when I first heard her say that, I thought, I didn't know that. But I just can't imagine not saying something like that unless you knew it for sure. Yeah.
I think that was a bold thing to say because obviously she wasn't there, and I'm happy that she corrected it. But it did. That's a tough thing in a question and answer. You've got to be able to, if you're going to push back.
Okay, so I was just looking at an interesting essay from 2023 by a bloke called Musa al-Gharbi. So apparently from Pakistan or somewhere like that, and he's quite the innovative thinker. Right, he has a lot of things that you don't hear in many places.
Which one is more responsible for the fact that they are further apart now than they used to be? Which one would you say shifted more? You can just shout it out. Great. Okay, so let's try it again. Next slide, please. Okay, so similar. You see two lines, they're close together, they go further apart. Which one is responsible? B. Great. See, the thing is when the pictures are like this in black and white, and when you have generic titles like A and B, no one would mistake what's going on in these pictures. But then something really funny happens when you start coloring the lines red or blue, or adding labels to the lines like Democrat and Republican. All of a sudden, things that are really obvious, that anyone can just look at the picture and see, become really tough for people to see, including for fancy nerds like myself. So if you look at the first image I showed you was from an essay by a political scientist that was published in the New York Times. I think you can see the original picture behind me. What the graph shows you is the Democratic and Republican Party platforms from 2000 to 2016. And so you can see that after 2008, at 2008, the parties were kind of close together. 2012, the Republicans shifted a little bit more to the right, but then in 2016, they kind of moderated. But the parties grew further apart than ever. Why? Because of changes in the blue line. Democrats, after 2012,
Okay, so this guy wrote a long, thoughtful essay on the happiness gap. All right, there's a significant happiness gap between liberals and conservatives, particularly among teenagers. Right? Liberal teens consistently much more likely to suffer from mental illness. So liberal girls tend to be much more significantly depressed than boys, particularly after 2011, right? After the Great Awakening. Right? The more educated a teen's family was, the more likely the young people were to be depressed, and the more dramatic their rise in depression after 2012. So I know a lot of Jews, and being transgender is virtually unknown among Orthodox Jews. On the other hand, I know a lot of non-Orthodox Jews where being transgender and gay, particularly in Los Angeles and New York City, is increasingly common. And so becoming transgender or becoming gay significantly correlates with a major increase in mental illness. So why is it that liberal teens are more consistently depressed than conservatives? Right? And why is this connected to the Great Awakening? Well, conservatives do not just report higher levels of happiness, they also report higher levels of meaning in their lives. And this happiness and meaning effect is enhanced when conservatives are surrounded by other people like themselves. So when we have a more coherent, cohesive, and homogeneous society, all right, Americans are much happier, but conservative Americans in particular are much happier. and this doesn't just happen in the United States, right? There's a positive association between a conservative outlook and happiness, right, in almost all countries surveyed. So 87 out of 92 countries surveyed, and conservative outlook always correlates with a higher level of happiness, because conservatives are more likely to be patriotic, they're more likely to be religious, and conservatism and patriotism and nationalism and preferring your in-group, this is what has been the norm in human history. It is modern liberalism that is exceptional in human history, right? Conservatives are more likely to be married, more likely to be happily married, less likely to divorce, right? Religiosity correlates with greater subjective and objective well-being. So does patriotism, so does marriage. So the more coherent, cohesive the community, all right, the less likely they are to vote for the Democrats, right? The more that people are in happy long-term marriages, right, the less likely they are to vote for Democrats. And conservatives, both politicians and laymen, tend to be much more conventionally attractive than liberals and to have better sex lives. People who are healthy in childhood are much more likely to become conservative as adults. It's stunning, the clarity of these results, right? Conservatism likewise renders people much more likely to get married and stay married. So I had a few years of my life where I flirted with Marxism, and I was less happy and less healthy, less mentally healthy, and that preceded my collapse into chronic fatigue syndrome, my just few years of public performance as an atheistic communist, because there was no objective moral code. There weren't the traditional ties to family, to your in-group, to community and nation in the left-wing outlook. Right. Independent of religious attendance, liberals are twice as likely to report mental illness as conservatives. So plenty of liberals go to church, but they're still twice as likely to report mental illness, right, as compared to conservatives. So religiosity provides benefits independent of conservatism, but nonetheless, the effects of religion are dramatically enhanced among conservatives in a way that is distinct from moderates and liberals. Right? The well-being gap is not simply a product of conservatives being more religious. It also seems to be a product of conservatism itself, and it manifests even when you control for level of religiosity. So about 20% of Orthodox Jews in America vote Democrat, and among those who do, right, they consistently don't appear to me as happy and as mentally stable as those who vote Republican. That's just purely anecdotal. Now, winners in the current economy, increasingly the people who are the most depressed. So it's hard to explain the happiness gap as purely a function of privilege. Immigrants and minorities in America are more likely to be religiously and socially conservative compared to native-born whites. Immigrants and racial and ethnic minorities also have significantly less depression compared to native whites. Conservatism has larger well-being effects for senior citizens, more for senior citizens than for young people, because conservatism helps adherents preserve a sense of value, meaning, and self-esteem, even when they are no longer as physically vital, sexually active, mentally acute, or economically productive as they once were. So this guy is quite interesting. Elite Gatekeepers. Here he is talking about elite gatekeepers.
Purpose of a school like Columbia. They're not just elite schools. They're schools for elites. They choose, and it's not a secret, that schools like these basically select who gets to be congresspeople. Senators, presidents, Supreme Court justices, they overwhelmingly hail from the small number of schools. 80% of tenure-track professors come from the top 20% of schools.
Right, he's got a lot of interesting things to say. So let's fast forward to him.
I've done a few pieces on how scholars and journalists try to understand Trump and the Trump phenomenon. One of them, for instance, I showed that just the level of discussion about Donald Trump was unlike any candidate in modern history as far back as the empirical record goes, as far as the newspaper corpus I have going back to the 70s. For instance, in 2018, Trump was the number 3 most used word in all of the New York Times, excluding like and, the, but, or. The average New York Times article mentioned Trump directly 1 to 2 times, and then indirectly another 2 to 3 times, like commander-in-chief. And this was a corpus that included everything: weather, sports, drama, you name it. It included everything published by the New York Times. And so it was clear that Trump had become kind of a lens through which people interpret reality during that period, a kind of frame through which all other stories were filtered in a way that was probably not helpful for our sanity or for understanding the social world and so on. Both scholars and journalists, pretty early on, were committed to the idea that the only way that someone could support Donald Trump, as if there's something wrong with them. In particular, we, as in journalists and academics, seized on a handful of narratives, namely Trump voters are racist, they're sexist, and so forth. And this actually...
Okay, and back to his essay in American Affairs Journal, right? The relationship between conservatism and happiness is especially pronounced in countries facing threat, right? And the well-being benefits of religion and patriotism are enhanced by difficult material circumstances, right? So the idea that the relationship between conservatism and happiness is driven primarily by social advantage and system justification just does not hold up, right? Conservatism, religiosity, patriotism helps people make sense of, remain resilient in the face of, and respond constructively to inequality and misfortune without regard for where they fall in the social strata. On the other hand, liberal ideology does not provide the same benefits, right? Conservatives report significantly higher levels of happiness than liberals. Liberals are significantly more likely to experience adverse mental and emotional conditions. People who identify with liberal ideology are significantly more likely than others to be depressed, anxious, and to rank high on neuroticism. Liberals are also much more likely than conservatives to be diagnosed with mental illness or disorders. So there's going to be a major mental health crisis in liberal America if Donald Trump gets reelected.
Because we were locked into these analytic frames pretty early on, it actually made it difficult for us to see data that were right in front of our face that really complicate that story a lot. So for instance, in 2016, white turnout was stagnant. So Trump didn't spur a bunch of whites to come to the ballot box to defend white supremacy or something like that. There was not an increase in white turnout. And Trump actually got a smaller share of the white vote than Mitt Romney did. So white turnout was stagnant. He didn't do exceptionally well with white people. In fact, the reason he was able to win in 2016 was because he gained a larger share of the black vote than Mitt Romney did, a larger share of the Hispanic vote, a larger share of the Asian vote. And unfortunately, not only were people unable to perceive this in the 2016 election cycle, because again, they were just convinced that the only way he could have won was white supremacy. People didn't learn a lot from that election to see, as I showed in some of my other work around that time, this trend of attrition among non-whites away from the Democratic Party was something that...
Okay, this is Musa al-Gharbi. I believe he's originally from Pakistan. He writes here in American Affairs Journal, contemporary young people are more likely to be diagnosed with a mental condition than older Americans. Women are more likely to be diagnosed with a psychiatric condition than men. The gaps are much larger among contemporary cohorts as compared to earlier ones. However, across all age groups and for both genders, liberals are roughly twice as likely as conservatives to report being diagnosed with mental illness. And I've got a link to this freely available article in the video description, and I'm also going to put it in the chat. So does neuroticism cause liberalism, or is it the other way around? It's the other way around according to the evidence that he cites, and he substantiates his point. Now, normally when scholars study this, they describe the conservative advantage in happiness as pathological. It's an outgrowth of privilege, system justification, lack of awareness, or empathy. Right? So conservative well-being tends to be described by academics in pathological terms. And so there's very little work exploring how and to what extent liberal ideology contributes to mental illness among liberals. Now, it's possible that genetics and biology explain much of the observed relationship between liberal identification and mental illness. There is robust evidence that individuals' political, ideological, and moral dispositions are biologically based and hence heritable. But it turns out that cognitive sophistication reinforces and exacerbates intrinsic differences rather than reduce them. Right? You'd think that cultural interventions such as education will help people transcend their biological differences and approach common ground, but no, it's the opposite. Psychological dispositions and disorders are also significantly influenced by genes and biology, and once again, cognitive sophistication, having a higher IQ, exacerbates ideological differences rather than ameliorates them. So there is evidence that children who are maladjusted, angry, aggressive, and antisocial are more likely to align themselves with left-wing politics as adults. people who experience abuse, insecurity, and trauma as children are more likely to identify as liberal rather than conservative. As adults, they are more likely to report mental illness as adults. People who score highly on the dark triad characteristics of narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism are much more likely to gravitate towards various strains of social justice ideology and authoritarianism. And some versions of liberal ideology do impose significant mental costs on those who embrace them. That is, there are certain strains of left-wing views that render people more likely to be depressed, anxious, or unwell. And we see this explosion in mental illness among liberals after the Great Awakening. The more liberal countries and the more liberal regions within countries tend to have higher rates of mental disorders. So one explanation for this is that liberalism makes you question more things and come up with more things and make more choices, all right? In a traditional society, you have fewer choices. Your purpose in life is to fit yourself to a greater system than yourself, a system of transcendent morality and meaning, and your task is to do your duty and to fit yourself to this transcendent system. While from a liberal enlightened perspective, you get to choose meaning, purpose, morality all on your own. You get to develop your hero system within your own brain. That's not a traditional outlook.
Actually started in about 2010. So it had been going on for actually multiple midterm and general election cycles before the 2016 election. 2016 was just the first race where it changed the outcome of the race. But it was something that journalists had a hard time understanding because we were locked into the idea that Trump is racist. And then in 2018 and 2020, you saw the same trends. So in 2018, Republicans held their margins with African Americans, with Asians, with Hispanics. The reasons why Democrats saw big gains was because of attrition among white voters.
Okay, back to his essay. Americans who give more frequently, give the highest share of their income, donate specifically to causes to alleviate human poverty and suffering, tend to be right-leaning and religious. Now, liberals have a broader sphere of moral concern and tend to feel higher levels of empathy, but those sentiments don't lead them to incur higher costs and risks on behalf of others in the same manner as conservatives. So liberals tend to be troubled, not just by the state of their own nation and community, but by the plight of animals, the plight of nature, by people and events in other countries, by hypothetical and projected future trends, as well as historical injustices, right? Things that the typical person has no meaningful control or influence over. So this natural tendency of people on the left to be more troubled is a significant source of depression and anxiety and moral distress, to use a term from medicine. Liberals tend to be less emotionally stable than conservatives, but they are far more likely to prize emotionality and to dwell on their emotions and the emotions of others. They tend to react much more severely to unfortunate events, from public tragedies to political defeats to global catastrophes. Not only are their initial responses significantly more dramatic, but liberals are also adversely affected for a longer period of time. Liberals are much more likely to find meaning in their life through politics and political activism. They tend to follow politics more closely and to participate more. But following politics closely and regularly engaging in politics tends to adversely affect people's mental and physiological well-being. Politics undermines liberals' social relationships. All right, liberals consistently have more politically homogeneous communities and social networks. They are far more likely to avoid, to break off, or to curb relationships over political differences, particularly white liberal women. And this cutting off of relationships leads to higher levels of anxiety, depression, and other mental illnesses. Right? A willingness to cancel one's family and friends over political or ideological differences is unlikely to enhance one's happiness or well-being. So there is a right-wing culture warrior, Abigail Shrier, with whom I agree on almost everything. Almost everything. But in the words of one Substack review, all right, where the author says that he's broadly sympathetic to Abigail Shrier's critiques in her book Bad Therapy, he says, but I just find this person stupid and evil. Right? That's not my reaction to Abigail Shrier. I just find much of her reasoning stupid. I agree with so much of what she says, but the way that she gets there just strikes me as stupid. And I just discovered this psychologist who I really like. She's 25, Anna Uden, and she's married, and she's not nearly as left-wing as she used to be. So she was much more woke in her earlier videos, but now she's tending more towards the center.
The introduction starts with Abigail giving an anecdote about when she took her son to the pediatric urgent care clinic because he's had a stomach ache. And she talks about how in came a man and said, "Would you mind giving us some privacy so that I can do our mental health screening?" And that she was shocked that the privacy he wanted was from her. Since Abigail is very shocked that this would happen, I actually have a pretty good explanation for why it did. Somatic symptoms like stomach aches severe enough to warrant a visit to urgent care can sometimes reflect something like inner turmoil or trauma. Given that the vast majority of kids experience abuse at the hands of their own family members, then it becomes pretty important to be able to screen for those things without the family members present. And even if it's not an issue of trauma, a kid might not feel comfortable disclosing what's going on in their mind with a parent present because they feel embarrassed or they don't know how the parent's going to take it, or all sorts of reasons. Now, I'm guessing this particular urgent care had some sort of screening determination that if a kid comes in with an unexplained somatic symptom, you do a quick mental health screening to cover your bases. Unfortunately, this is the world that we live in, where a lot of institutions and a lot of providers feel that they need to be very, very proactive about screening against risk because they don't want to miss something really important and they don't want to get in trouble themselves.
So I consistently find myself siding with Anna Uden's critique here rather than someone with whom I have much more agreement, right? Abigail Shrier, fellow Orthodox Jew, fellow conservative. Anna Uden, not conservative, right? Probably a little bit left of center, but I think she makes better points. Now, you might think that liberals report much more mental illness because they are more likely to pursue help when they feel distress, but that's not true. We've got studies showing that conservatives seem more likely to pursue assistance than liberals. So the main difference across ideological lines is that liberals are much more likely to seek out diagnoses even when they have moderate to low symptoms of poor mental health. But for those who experience high rates of distress, right, conservatives are more likely to seek help. Now, many liberal, affluent, highly educated spaces, you get increasing moral status in these spaces through association with formerly stigmatized identity. For example, by identifying as a racial, ethnic, or religious minority, a sexual minority, or a person with a mental or physical disability. So being mentally unwell can be a monetizable asset in many contemporary left-wing spaces. So there is absolutely a concerted effort to capitalize on mental illness, particularly on young women's mental illness. It's a marketable commodity. There are also perverse incentive structures in certain liberal spaces to push many to seek out diagnoses even when they are not experiencing severe symptoms. Others who are not part of that particular culture would feel less pressure or eagerness to get themselves classified as disabled. Highly educated and relatively affluent white liberals are the Americans most likely to identify as feminists, anti-racist, or allies, or to hold far left views on cultural issues. At the same time, affluent whites believe themselves to be the source of virtually all the world's problems, right? So these ideologies villainize the very people who are most likely to embrace them. So white liberals tend to view all other racial and ethnic subgroups more warmly than they view their own group. Right? There's no other combination of ideology and race and ethnicity that produces a similar pattern. Right? So just imagine being part of a group that you hate. Right? This creates strong dissociative pressures on many white liberals. Probably helps to explain the radicalized differences among liberals with respect to mental health. Right? Liberals, especially white liberals, are much more anxious about interactions across difference. The perceptions, judgments, and behaviors of liberals change dramatically based on the demographic characteristics of the people they are engaging with or referring to, while conservatives are generally more consistent. So liberals, and white liberals in particular, much more likely to second-guess their behaviors and motives, to dwell on awkward past interactions, and to worry about how others perceive them. So this type of rumination is associated with heightened anxiety and depression.
think you can understand why prioritizing a kid's potential safety is more important than offending the parent. Now, she has to actually look at this person's questionnaire, and I will admit the questions are pretty terrible and very leading. I don't think I can say what they are because they're very related to unaliving, and I don't want for this video to get demonetized. But it is pretty clear that this is a questionnaire meant to cover the institution's liability and not necessarily to get a sense of what's going on with the kid. So I agree, terrible questionnaire, but it's there for a reason. And then she goes on to talk about how her generation thought they were doing so much better at raising kids without spanking and things like that. And how did it come to be that her generation raised a generation of kids that disclosed so much more trauma and disclosed so much more mental illness, and who even declared that they don't want kids of their own? Apparently that is something very problematic for Abigail. She talks about how in this day and age, everything that used to be normal is now considered a diagnosis. Like shyness is now social anxiety disorder, being a disruptive student is now ADHD, and I actually do agree that we are over-diagnosing kids, though again, the reason for this is largely due to systemic factors, like insurance companies demanding a diagnosis in order to cover treatment. And then she introduces one of the main pieces of her issue with modern-day therapy, which is that modern-day therapists think that everybody needs therapy because everyone's a little bit broken, and she takes issue with this. To this I say, wellness is more than just the absence of disease. Wellness to me means a person living in alignment with their values, experiencing joy and gratitude, experiencing connection with the people around them, feeling like they have power to execute.
So this 25-year-old's got a great YouTube account, but she does have a voice that's kind of stuck in her larynx. There's not a lot of vocal and melodic varieties. She speaks very much in a monotone, but the content is excellent.
The things that they want in their life, being in a state of flow very regularly in their life. That's to me what wellness is. Wellness is not just the absence of a diagnosis. So somebody could be not well while also not having a diagnosis, and mental health treatment can absolutely help that person achieve that wellness. Then in chapter 1, she goes into iatrogenesis, which is the side effects of something that's meant to be a treatment. She describes her own experiences with therapy and proposes the idea that while adults can challenge and push back on their therapist's interpretations, kids don't have that same ability because of the power imbalance. And this to me doesn't quite make sense because...
Right. If you know any kids, the idea that they can't push back is ridiculous.
Kids have a power imbalance with any sort of adult. And also because therapists actually make a lot of strides in trying to even out those power imbalances. That's not to say that it's always even, but therapists...
Okay, back to this excellent essay on the huge happiness gap between liberals and conservatives. White liberals, far more likely than any other group to claim to have a mental illness or disorder. Right? Whites who identify as very liberal or liberal, about twice as likely to claim mental illness as non-whites who share the same ideology. But non-white liberals are also significantly more likely to report mental illness than non-white moderates or conservatives. Right? So certain strains of liberal ideology appear to exert uniquely pernicious effects among women and people of color, right? So in much of the left, there are great efforts made to sensitize everyone to historical and ongoing bias and discrimination. Women and minorities are told to attribute negative outcomes in their lives to racism or sexism. They're encouraged to interpret ambiguous encounters or situations uncharitably, such as manifestations of racism, sexism, and homophobia. And these tendencies undermine the well-being of the populations they are supposed to help. So heightened perceptions of bias and discrimination are robustly associated with mental anguish, social strain, and adverse physical outcomes. Right? The more people perceive themselves to be surrounded by others who harbor bias or hostility against them, the more they view their life prospects as hostage to a system that is fundamentally rigged against them, the more likely they become to experience anxiety, depression, and various psychosomatic health problems, or to then behave in antisocial ways. Right? If you have a liberal ideology that pushes adherents to perceive people and phenomena as racist, sexist, and homophobic, right, this leads, of course, to increased levels of anxiety, depression, and other disorders. Liberal ideology is associated with heightened perceptions of bias and discrimination. Liberal women are far more significantly more likely than others to perceive themselves to have been victims of sexual harassment or sex-based discrimination, right? And the more these women are educated, right, the more they are likely to see themselves as victims of such discrimination. Perceptions of discrimination correlate strongly with educational attainment. which also predisposes people to the left. So Black Americans are significantly more likely to see themselves as victims of prejudice and discrimination when they or their parents have higher levels of educational attainment. So socioeconomic status tends to have diminishing health returns for African Americans as compared to whites. Similar realities hold for Latinos and Asian Americans. Higher educational attainment leads to heightened perceptions of discrimination and to a decline in mental health.
Therapists are actually trained in making the client know, even if the client is a child, that they have equal footing and that they can vocalize what they need. Abigail seems to be very preoccupied with kids possibly being influenced by adults other than herself. So she goes into her theory about how when we send people to therapy that don't actually have.
Okay, let's just allow Abigail.
This is the recent interview with Nick Gillespie.
Impression of my mom, or look, my parents were difficult in that regard, but I wouldn't call them toxic, and I don't think breaking off with them is the right move.
Wow, this woman's got a edge to her. Wow, she has got a chip on her shoulder.
It's very hard for a teenager or a child to say those things, especially if they're angry with mom. They don't know what constitutes emotional abuse, especially if an adult is leading them to think that they were emotionally abused, say, or that they had experienced trauma. And with a child, you don't have their buy-in. So a therapist is naturally going to want to pander to a child to get them on board. Now, if a child has a severe problem that they're coming to a therapist with, that sort of focuses the mind. You've got a kid who's anorexic or severely OCD, you know what they're going to be talking about. But you drop off a kid for general psychodynamic psychotherapy with, a kid who's got some anxiety, some feelings of the blues, and the therapist could lead in any direction. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, can you?
Okay, I think the psychologist's critique here is sharper than Abigail's.
A severe mental illness, that it actually does more harm than good. She says you wouldn't get an x-ray unless you needed one, but an x-ray, as we know, could actually create cancer if.
Yeah, Abigail's reasoning is so bad, and I'm generally sympathetic to her point of view, but her reasoning provoked that one critique on Substack to consider her stupid and evil, even though the author of the critique basically agreed with her.
Exposed to it long term. So possible carcinogen compared to somebody providing a mental health service, a little bit different. She says, just maybe don't send your kids off to therapy unless they absolutely require it. Which to me is kind of like saying, don't take your kid for an annual checkup at the primary care physician unless they seem to be unhealthy. She says that any intervention strong enough to cure a person is also strong enough to hurt them. And while this is true, therapy as a whole is not an intervention. Therapy is made up of different types of therapy, and those different types of therapy are made up of a lot of different interventions. It's not all one intervention. When people go to a therapist, first the therapist assesses, is this a good fit? Does your presenting concern, does your particular personality fit in with the type of therapy that I provide? And if not, they refer out. And then the intervention is tailored to the patient. An aggressive patient isn't going to get, for instance, assertiveness training. A shy one, a passive person, might get assertiveness training. It's not like therapy is this one-size-fits-all intervention that gets put onto everybody and has the same possible effects on everybody. Then I thought this was interesting. She cites that therapy can make marital stress worse, person's resilience, can render a patient more traumatized, more depressed, lower their self-efficacy. And I looked at the reference she put for this claim because I was wondering, well, what are we talking about?
Right. Here's another giveaway of her shoddy reasoning. All right, she makes these huge claims in the book, and then the footnote to support the claim does not support the claim. All right, this is what Kevin MacDonald would also do in Culture of Critique. Abigail Shrier is exhibiting the same sort of Nick Fuentes, Kevin MacDonald, Joe Rogan, Al Sharpton quality of intellectual reasoning.
Talking about long-term or short-term? Are we talking about like while therapy is still ongoing? Because sometimes people get worse before they get better. What type of treatment, what population, what age range are we talking about? I looked at the source. This article does list some possible negative side effects of therapy, but those are distress, worsening of symptoms, and strains in family relationships. And the study was done with people who had been seen for 10 plus sessions of CBT in particular. This is to be expected in therapy. it is expected that once you finally shine a light on the stuff that you've been avoiding, that it's going to get a little harder before you.
And ironically, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is the one type of therapy that Abigail Shrier promotes.
Can move forward from it. It was also a lot more specific than the claim she's making. It's about one particular type of therapy in one study with one population.
Also, I just wanted to mention that the patients in the study were diagnosed with mild to moderate psychopathology, most commonly depression, anxiety, and personality disorders, with 43% of them having been hospitalized at least once. So if Abigail's claim is that people get negative iatrogenic effects from unnecessary therapy, this study does not support her argument at all. These were not people who went to therapy for no reason, and as we know, symptoms are bound to worsen during exposure therapy before they start to taper off.
She takes issue with the APA's claim that therapy helps people live more fulfilling lives by saying there is alas no proof that they accomplish any of that in aggregate, which doesn't really make sense to me because why would they need to accomplish that in aggregate? Like, do we ask all of medicine to prove the efficacy of all of medicine as a whole? No, we look at specific interventions for specific populations. There are specific types of therapy and specific interventions that are shown to be effective for specific presenting concerns. And therapists are well aware of what kinds of disorders do or don't work for the type of therapy that they provide. She sort of ends this chapter by saying that we would expect a population that is otherwise healthy, that has gone to mental health treatment unnecessarily, to have a lot of iatrogenic effects. So here we see sort of her thesis that Gen Z is mentally ill because they are having iatrogenic effects to therapy. This operates under the assumption that kids are being sent to therapy for no reason, when in reality, by the time somebody ends up in therapy,
Okay, that's a mighty big word there, iatrogenic.
Iatrogenic.
Wow. Okay, that means illness that is caused by medical treatment.
it is a very last resort for most cases. People don't want to go to therapy. They don't want to talk about the hard stuff. They don't want to pay somebody week after week. They only really go to therapy if they really have to, if they're in a lot of distress, or if somebody else says that it's impacting their life. But even if this were true, even if people were sending their kids to therapy for no reason at all, correlation does not equal causation. It's a very basic concept that, as we'll see later, Abigail is well aware of. And then chapter 2 is all about how therapy seems to be making kids worse. So she starts off with another anecdote about her interviewing a high school girl, and the girl is telling her that all her kids are mentally ill and have all these issues, and the therapy doesn't seem to be helping. My issue with this is that we don't know how that person would have been if they didn't have therapy. Therapy could be helping. Things could be a lot better now than if this kid did not have therapy. That's why when
Okay, back to the essay on the significant happiness gap between liberals and conservatives. So for people of color, getting educated in America is to be cudgeled relentlessly with messages about how oppressed, exploited, and powerless we are, and how white people need it to get it together to change this, but probably never will. Right? Narratives like these grew especially pronounced during the post-2011 Great Awakening. And so internalizing these messages probably contributes to observed ideological gaps in psychic distress among women and people of color. Even when minorities don't directly suffer from anxiety or depression, they regularly suffer because these disorders nonetheless, because the challenges of dealing with white liberal peers and their idiosyncratic neuroses and dispositions are often a key source of burnout for minorities in progressive spaces. Right? The many strains of liberal ideology fashionable among the most educated and affluent Americans tend to work in practice as a form of reverse cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy encourages people to avoid global labeling and black and white or zero thinking. Right? It pushes people to abstain from hyperbole and catastrophizing and to avoid filtering out the good while highlighting the bad. So cognitive behavioral therapy encourages people to resist emotional reasoning, to resist jumping to conclusions, to resist mind reading, to resist uncharitable motive attributions. It tells people not to make strong assumptions about what others should do or feel or how the world should be. Right? People are encouraged to meet the world as it is, to engage the actual over the ideal, to look for solutions to problems rather than focusing inordinately on who is to blame and punishing them. It tells patients to focus on controlling what they can in the present rather than ruminating on misfortunes of the past or worrying about futures that may not come to pass. Encourages people to see themselves as resilient and capable rather than weak, vulnerable, helpless, and damaged. So popular strains of liberal thinking invert this guidance. Right, so the more liberal a community gets, the more mental illness you get. Liberal peers after 2011 become much more aggressive in villainizing, suppressing, and punishing anyone who disagrees with them on contentious cultural issues. Right, this likely has a pernicious effect on conservative teens too. Being branded a racist, sexist, homophobe and treated as a moral monster can have major deleterious effects on one's well-being. But attempts by external parties to shame people into compliance usually generate resistance, backlash, and deviance over the longer term. So the temporary dramatic increase in negative affect among conservatives in the early years of the awakening as a result of being more aggressively mocked, derided, censored, and purged, followed by a leveling off or decline as right-aligned Americans increasingly came to dismiss and to resist progressive attempts to characterize them as evil.
When we look at the research, we look at overall trends between the control group and the treatment group. And also, something that a lot of people don't want to talk about is that not all diseases are curable, and this also applies for some mental illnesses. Some people are just going to struggle with a disorder for the rest of their life. And it's not a matter of curing it, but rather managing it. And you certainly wouldn't expect those people to have already cured it as teenagers when there are a whole host of different stressors and changes biologically, socially, familially, that are going to greatly stress that person. The fact that somebody isn't completely symptom-free doesn't mean that the therapy's not working. So this interviewee tells Abigail that there are two sets of friends in her circle, those who have very severe mental illness and those who are seeking explanations for their unhappiness. And Abigail disagreed with how this interviewee regarded the two on a spectrum, but they are a continuum. They're actually not a dichotomy. Every single mental health issue is on a continuum. It's not the type of thing where you either have it or you don't, or it's either severe or you have nothing at all. Is this something I really need to explain? She talks about how 42...
So thinking about the happiness gap between liberals and conservatives, just think about the most conservative commentators like Dennis Prager and Tucker Carlson. These are really happy people. And then on the other hand, think about the most prominent liberal commentators such as Destiny, right? Not such a mentally stable person.
2% of the current generation has a mental health diagnosis, which makes normal increasingly abnormal. And like I said, while I do agree that there is a lot of overdiagnosing of kids, particularly for insurance purposes, this might not be as unusual as she's making it seem. When you think about the fact that over 95% of the population has at least one health concern, a third of them have 5 or more ailments, and 45% of them have a chronic illness, why is it unusual that a lot of people would also have mental health struggles? The mind is a part of the body, and when we act like mental...
Yeah, Anna Uden, I think, is just consistently making great points here. Right, here is the Abigail Shrier, author of Bad Therapy.
Can you talk a little bit, what are the numbers and the trends in terms of psychiatric diagnoses of kids, from, I don't know, from 2 to 20 or thereabouts, and also with medication? There was, going back, God, it's like almost 20 years when Adderall and Ritalin.
So who puts you more at ease, right? So one great measure of somebody's mental health is how they make you feel, what it's like to be around them, right? Does Abigail Shrier put you at ease, or does Anna Uden put you more at ease?
And really were a topic of discussion for treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or just attention deficit disorder. There was a big discussion of that. That has kind of receded, but what have you found? How many kids are on I was going to say psychotropic, I'll say psychoactive drugs and in active therapy?
Yeah, you bring up ADHD. We only stopped talking about ADHD, not because it was being diagnosed any less. There's more diagnosis, but because so many young kids are on SSRIs today, the antidepressants. I mean, they just cleared, the FDA just.
So the success rate for ADHD medication is over 90%, right? The success rate for SSRIs is about 30%.
Cleared Lexapro, which is a very strong antidepressant for 7-year-olds. So it's not that it's not, in fact, we've been going in one direction, putting kids on more and more and more, so psychotropic drugs, anti-anxiety medications, and various forms of speed, as you mentioned, for ADHD. Right. So in 2016.
So ADHD medication is not speed, right? It shares some similarities with speed, but it's not just pure speed.
illness is so much worse than physical illness. We are stigmatizing mental illness. We are acting like this is something that should be extremely rare because it's so terrible, when in reality it's something that most people struggle with at some point in their life. Mental diagnoses are not a reflection of somebody's character. Then she talks about something called the treatment prevalence paradox, where she says that therapists are no longer happy just treating the ill and now they want to support the healthy. Again, I feel like I can offer some insight on this. It's called preventative care. It targets people at the prevention stage before things get so bad that they get in a lot of distress and it's even more of a financial burden on their families and the industry. It's actually considered a very effective way to prevent mental illness from getting worse. But then in the next paragraph, she talks about preventative care in the context of medical illnesses. So she definitely has heard of it, but she doesn't really point out the discrepancy in what she's saying, that preventative care is okay for medical illnesses, but not for mental ones. It just goes right into, as treatments for anxiety and depression have become more sophisticated and readily available, adolescent anxiety and depression have ballooned. Again, seemingly inferring causality there. Later in the chapter, she acknowledges.
And treatment for anxiety and depression is not terribly effective, right? It has a quite low effectiveness rate compared to treatment for ADHD.
Is that it could just be a coincidence. It doesn't necessarily imply causality, but it is peculiar, in her words. She says it might provide a clue that the treatments aren't actually helping. So it kind of sounds like she's saying, yes, correlation does not always equal causation, but it could be. It's peculiar, isn't it? She acknowledges that most therapists would probably say she has the causality reversed, that people are mentally ill in greater quantities or are more open about their mental illness, and that this results in more people seeking therapy. And she says that from her interviews with therapists, when she's asked them why are people getting more mentally ill, the things they usually point to are smartphones, the pandemic, and climate change. I would also add in there economic instability and also unhealthy lifestyles. I think those also play a huge role. So then she takes each of these three things one by one, and she basically makes the case that all three of them are actually therapists' fault, because therapists are not telling parents to set limits around technology with their kids. Says who?
Why you always lying?
Because therapists should have advocated for public health policy during the pandemic, basically to tell the CDC to send kids back to school. And because therapists are telling kids they need to catastrophize about climate change and not challenging those cognitions. And I get it, the book needed a good villain in order to get its readers riled up. It follows the formula of fearmonger about something that's happening, and then you need a scapegoat to blame for what that's fearmongering about, and then you're going to present all of the evidence that supports your viewpoint and ignore all the one that doesn't. Let's take each of these one by one. So starting with the smartphone, she says that mental health experts embrace smartphone use, dismiss their impact on adolescents, offer seminars to teens and parents on responsible social media use.
We have an increasing number of schools that are banning smartphone use or any cell phone. So I don't think the direction is experts are just embracing cell phones for kids.
Which she says is like drug counselors lecturing on the appropriate uses of drugs. That is a very insincere comparison. It's more like teaching safe driving or teaching safe sex than appropriate use.
Right. Abigail Shrier's distortion of the evidence and her dishonest way of argumentation indicate there's a screw loose with this woman. I mean, she is just off her rocker.
1 in 6 kids between the ages of 2 and 8. This is according to the CDC. 1 in 6 kids between the ages of 2 and 8 already had a mental health or behavioral diagnosis. Now, those kids weren't on social media. Okay. Right. They didn't have smartphones, certainly not in 2016. They don't have them today. So we knew that this diagnosis has been exploding, and also mental health treatment has gone in one direction. So nearly 40% of the rising generation has been to see a therapist already. Right. And, I'm not the only one to have noticed this. A team of researchers did earlier a year ago and called this the treatment prevalence paradox. What they were noticing is that with treatment of illness, the more you have the more treatment there is, the more the point prevalence rate of a disorder should go down, right? We saw this with breast cancer treatment and other things. The incidence of death from breast cancer went down with more pervasive treatment. Here, there's been vast expansion of treatment, and the rates of depression and anxiety have only gone up.
And I'm
right, and correlation does not mean causation.
Use of drugs. And I'm not sure where she heard that mental health experts are dismissing the negative effects of technology, considering there are countless studies coming out on this year after year after year. As for the pandemic, like I said, it's
right. The degree of bad faith that Abigail Shrier consistently shows is mind-boggling.
Not really therapists' place to dictate public health policy, but these were discussions that we were definitely having within and outside of the therapy room, that the pandemic has caused a mental health crisis with adolescents. These are conversations that we are having, even if Abigail acts like they're not. And as for climate change, Abigail seems to be of the opinion that therapists should just tell kids they're exaggerating about the catastrophic effects of climate change. And she says that in her interviews with young people, none of them gave climate change as a reason for their emotional struggles, which that's great that that was her experience, but I can tell you that having worked with young people myself as a therapist, this is something that they bring up quite a lot.
Yeah, young people on the left, right? So people on the left, right, they are more worried, they are more adversely affected by what happened in the past, what could happen in the future, what happens on the other side of the world, right? They are having much more distress for much longer periods of time than conservatives.
I used to work at a college counseling center where it was something that was being brought up quite a bit. And she makes the very grand statement that, in fact, there's very little evidence that individual psychotherapy helps young kids at all. Which is actually not true. Based on the CDC itself, parent training in behavior management works well for ADHD and disruptive behavior disorders, child behavior therapy works well for ADHD and disruptive behavior disorders, and CBT works well for disruptive behavior disorders, depression, anxiety, and PTSD. With all due respect, I trust the CDC a little bit more on this, but I did actually look at the references she cited, and I was actually surprised that it's not as effective as I expected it to be. And this is definitely cause for concern, but it might not be that much more different than it is for adults. Because relapse prevention is always a concern with any sort of therapy, and good therapy tries to prep clients to not fall into relapse after therapy is over. But of course, things come up, and without support, there's always the risk of backtracking sometimes. And when that happens,
right, in the long run, we'll all be dead. Right, if you can get an intervention that improves the quality of your life for days, weeks, months, or years, right, but the effect peters out after 5-10 years, all right, you're ahead of the game. You're a winner.
Happens, it's not the end of the world. It might just be time for a checkup back at the therapist. But at the end,
so here's what gets me. All right, Abigail Shrier seems to embody for me just so much of right-wing discourse. All right, just the lack of good faith, the distortion of evidence, the reckless accusations, just the shoddy intellectual quality of her arguments.
I mean, supporters of that trend would say, well, that's because it's an epidemic. It's a pandemic of anxiety, of depression, of isolation, of whatever. But you're effectively saying that it's probably more caused by the intervention itself, because
and she doesn't have any evidence for that. And it's telling. Elon Musk, Jordan Peterson, and Richard Hanania all praised Abigail Shrier's book, Bad Therapy. Right? That's how terrible their judgment is. Jordan Peterson, Elon Musk, Richard Hanania, they all praised this shoddy book.
And before we go on to a longer discussion of iatrogenesis, which I think is a great underappreciated concept in medicine in general, but certainly in psychology or psychiatry. Also talk about how the therapy culture has gone into schools, because it used to be certainly 30 years ago, 40 years ago, schools did not necessarily have teachers weren't.
Yeah, therapeutic culture can be a bad thing, right? There's a time and a place for therapy. There are many things that work better than therapy for certain problems, such as often a 12-step program or developing a stronger network of friends, right? Just like biology has its place, right? Therapy has its place. Sports have their place. Religion have their place. There's no one magic key for all problems.
End of the day, we do know that working with the parents of kids is often more effective than working with the kids themselves. The issue becomes that a lot of parents just want to send their kids off to therapy, and when the therapist tells them, hey, actually, I'd love to work with you, or maybe you should see somebody, they're completely closed off from that. They don't want to actually get involved. It's kind of more of this fix my kid, he's the problem type of thing. In this chapter, Abigail praises one of the therapists she interviewed for disclosing the iatrogenic effects in a waiver to his therapy clients. She seems to think that this is just something that one random therapist did, when in reality, all therapists do this in informed consent forms. It's not called a waiver, it's called an
Right. She thinks that, oh, this is unusual. Every single therapist pretty much does one of these forms. Abigail Shrier just takes no time to understand what she's writing about.
informed consent. So, what are the steps of bad therapy? Well, step 1 is teach kids to pay attention to their feelings. Yeah, you heard that right. The first step of bad therapy is to get kids to pay attention to their feelings. Abigail literally thinks that asking somebody how they're feeling or teaching them to check in with their feelings is harmful. She loves to use the expression shake it off in a very invalidating.
Right, so this is Anna Uden, who's the speaker. She's got a PhD in psychology. She's critiquing a book by a journalist, Abigail Shrier.
Manner, like just shake off the feeling that you have. But in reality, we know that avoidance of emotions, denial, and suppression of emotions makes things far worse. In fact, avoidance can actually be a compulsion within anxiety and OCD issues. And in general, it's just like a beach ball. The harder you try to push it underwater to drown it, the harder it's going to pop back up. The issues aren't going to go away just because you want to ignore them. They're going to pop up in different areas of your life across time when it's harder to get rid of them. As we can see from the study on the role of avoidance of emotional material in anxiety disorders, emotional avoidance and thought suppression not only hinder the learning process and maintain anxious responding, but they also actually heighten anxious responding to threatening cues and interfere with emotion functionality, thereby further impeding adaptive responding. What about this other study on emotional avoidance, in which participants high in emotional avoidance responded with greater levels of...
So there is a time and a place where you should not be exploring your emotions. All right, but a blanket denial that you should just pay no attention to what you're feeling is really bad advice. But yeah, when you go to work, this is not necessarily a time to explore your emotions. When you're getting an education, not necessarily a time to be exploring your emotions in math class. But the idea that in this big, beautiful world, you should never pay any attention to your emotions is ridiculous.
Of anxiety and affective distress, though not physiological arousal. They also experience greater levels of anxiety relative to the low emotional avoidance group when suppressing compared to observing their bodily sensations. Or what about this study that showed that high emotional avoidance and low social support predict the most severe depression?
Back on the show. Kip, you're becoming a legend, man. You've got the life, bro. And I really enjoy talking to you because you're not emotionally needy. I can criticize you, and you're just fine. So, welcome back to the show, Kip.
Hey, this is my buddy Little here. He's my redeemer. This is the one I told you. I've got a couple of cats and dogs. This is the one that was a sad sack when he came home, and I was like wondering if he was going to pull through. But he's not only did he pull through, he's a great little guy. But anyway, let me cut my TV down. Hold on just a second.
Yeah. No worries. So we'll get you back here.
Or this one on how emotion suppression can make it worse when you're recounting a distressing memory. Or this one that showed that a personality tends to be very suppressive in
Beverly
their negative
Hillbillies were a little bit
is
loud
great...
tonight. I was gonna ask you if you caught on to the fact that the Turkey had applied for the BRICS. Did you catch on to
that? No, but I don't think BRICS has almost anything in common except a name. I mean, they are at each other's throats. They are like the coalition of the fringe, gays and left-wing Jews and feminists and blacks. All right, the coalition of the fringe have nothing in common. BRICS have almost nothing in common except they're part of an organization. But no, I don't have any. I didn't see that about Turkey. What's the significance to you?
Well, I would just say they wanted to be in the EU. I guess the EU kept shunning them, but they said to hell with that. We'll just join the BRICS. And the significance is they're the second largest military in NATO behind America, with Poland being number 3. So, you know, I mean, I don't know if that meant that we could have depended on them, you know, in the future or whatever. But I just thought it was noteworthy from that regard. And another thing, I don't know that I've ever specifically talked to you about it, but does Luke Ford think the 2020 election was rigged?
Not at all.
Not at all. Not at all.
Not in the raw voting, in the sense that we had unprecedented rule changes, and we had Mark Zuckerberg massively subsidizing Democratic precincts for getting out the vote as compared to Republican leading communities. Yeah, in that sense, it probably had a distorted effect. The actual raw vote count, I don't think there was significant fraud, but in the sense that there were unprecedented changes to election laws, and there was a massive subsidy by Mark Zuckerberg for the first time for Democratic leading precincts as opposed to Republican leaning precincts to get out the vote. Yeah, I think there was probably some interference there.
Right. Yeah, some of the things of that election, to have our sitting president kicked off of both Facebook and Twitter, that's something. I mean, on one hand, we're having a hard time trying to relate it to something, because it's only been so recently that social media was the the place where everybody met to talk. And everybody's is like zoned out on the news, and they don't really care about the network news and that kind of stuff anymore. So, I mean, I think that was such a bigger deal than people realized in the moment. See, I'm like with you. I don't know about I find it odd that the corpse Biden got 80 million votes. You know, it was somebody that wasn't more charismatic or whatever. I just find it odd that he, of all people. So the only way that could have happened is there was some deep visceral fear of Donald Trump to the tune of 80 million people. But
yeah, well, that's all you need. It's a binary choice. If you really hate the other guy, there was no enthusiasm for Joe Biden, right? No one was passionate about Joe Biden, but there was a 2% swing against Trump in the suburbs in both the 2018 and 2020 election. So that's what happened. Some people in the middle of the road in the suburbs turned by a 2% margin against Donald Trump in both 2018 and 2020.
Right. I don't know. I just would have thought that the assassination attempt on him would have, like, I don't know, bought him a little bit more with people, just to hear, because one of the things that you and I are different on is, Luke, I don't know how much there is difference between our local elections and the elections, that America sticks their fingers in abroad. If you notice a couple of the qualifications, if you want to sign on to Globo Homo and get the checks from our government each year, one of the things is you got to have what they call free and fair elections. And the other thing is you got to have like what they call a free and open press. And like, there's a part of me that goes, you mean the type of press that's malleable to the point to where it can be the people can be manipulated. And so I wonder, you and I just take terms like free and fair for granted, but there's a little part of me that has never forgotten the fact that the people who really own this country or own this world even, I don't think they would trust the election to guys like Luke or Kip, less than they feel that there's sufficient training wheels on it to where we couldn't screw it up, that our choices couldn't screw it up, So I don't know. I think you and I are different. You think that a lot of things are like more straight up, and I think they're not. I don't know
about straight up. I mean, straight up in the sense that I expect everybody to pursue their self-interest. So most people who are powerful are on the center left or the left. And so, yeah, I expect them to pursue their interest in everything they do. And I expect people on the right to pursue their interests in everything they do.
Yeah. damn, it sounds conspiratorial. And I've told you, I try not to be Alex Jonesy, but there's a part of me that thinks stuff like the CIA is involved in ways that we just wouldn't even fathom. Like my favorite band was the Police, you know, and the drummer of the Police was Stuart Copeland. And he had a brother named Miles Copeland. And I believe Miles Copeland started IRS Records. IRS Records. It's like a record. It's like it's a record company and a PSYOP all in one. And then Miles Copeland's brother, he started a talent booking agency, and it was called FBI. Was the name of his talent booking agency. And then the youngest of the brothers was Stuart, and he forms a band which he names the Police. And it's just weird. IRS, FBI, the Police. Oh, and did I mention their dad, Miles Copeland, the father of Miles Copeland, he worked for the CIA. You get what I'm saying? So I have a hard time with like little things like that, which I know on one level, well, that's just clever, IRS records. That's just clever having a talent agency called FBI. That's just clever trying to get free advertising, calling your band the Police. But there, on some other level, it could have been a PSYOP. You get what I'm saying? I don't want to believe it. You get where I'm coming from, Luke?
Well, I think you're indulging a very common human emotion that goes back for thousands of years, that people have generally had quite a bit of skepticism and criticism for those who have a little bit more power than they do. So bosses do not tend to be popular. Supervisors do not tend to be popular with those below them. So it's a very human tendency is to cast aspersions on those who have more power than you do, right? It's just, it's a very appealing narrative, right? You can get a lot of viewers if you talk to them about how people with more power than they have are screwing them over, right?
Right.
That's just a human tendency. And so what I resist is just that knee-jerk assumption that people who have more power than you are screwing you over. I believe that people in power should be held accountable, but I don't believe that they should be unfairly criticized, even though it feels good to do so.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know that I'm casting dispersions on these people. I'm just saying sometimes I think propaganda and PSYOPs, if it were real, they are put forward sometimes like that in a way to where, you know, IRS, on one level, we think of it as a demonic agency. But look, IRS is the name of the company that found bands like REM. Did you appreciate REM coming up?
Yes,
Were you an
I
REM fan?
enjoy REM, and we could not have the United States of America without the IRS. So I'm sure the IRS does some bad things at times, but overall, they're absolutely essential to this country.
Not necessarily. I'm not with you there. I mean, you and I go off the rails in our thinking somewhat. Like sometimes I can tell you would think I would be happier off working somewhere, but I think that's like, I hate to call it propaganda, but I just think that's the thinking that's been instilled in you over the years. But before I got off, I did want to show you a picture. Sometimes we talk about this old bad dude that was a ladies' man and all that. Can you see that at all?
Yeah, I see that.
Like circa 1986 or whatever. And then the other thing made me think of you is you had said something about like maybe you got a little problem with the fact that your daughters don't look like you, but I don't know. I think it's their mom. They don't look Asian, do they? They don't look at it. They don't look at all Asian.
Not at all. No, they're gorgeous.
So if anything, I had one of them that said that people sometimes accused her of being Hispanic, but that's only because we gave her a name. That's probably used more for Spain and Hispanic people than it is for like English type people or whatever. So, but yeah, I had never even really thought about that till you mentioned that one day. But that's really all I had. I just wanted to give you a couple of nuggets to think about.
Thanks, bro.
Turkey and just, I'd like to believe that it's as close to straight up as you believe it is as far as the elections. But there's just a part of me, one conspiratorial guy that I used to listen to was a guy named Alan Watt, not Watts. That was a philosopher, but Watt, W-A-T-T. And this fella, he's no longer with us. But man, one time he did like a 1 hour talk on, I don't know, I think it was called like Real Reality or whatever.
Yeah, that's
and
Alan Watts, wasn't it? Alan Watts.
No, Alan Watts was more like a guru. And he had some effect on me too, because he lived on a houseboat. And after reading some of his books, lo and behold, I moved out on a houseboat myself. So he might have had some effect. But this guy, Alan Watt, without the S, some of his stuff sounded so conspiratorial, but every once in a while I would like look into it and I'd be like, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, but you can't, he's going out there and making a leap and you can make a couple of connect the dots, but you're like, I don't know if I can take that leap with you, brother, but it's thought provoking, some of the things that he used to put forward. But anyway, that's really all I had. Another great show. And
thanks,
keep it up. All right.
Thanks, man.
See you, man. Bye-bye.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Greater risk of large bowel cancer. But that was a pretty old study, so let's look at a more recent meta-analysis. This one from 2012 showed that repressive coping was linked to cancer.
So a meta-analysis is a survey, and you put together all studies in a particular area, and you see what the results are when you combine all the studies.
And cardiovascular diseases, especially hypertension, adding to the literature that repressive coping could be very detrimental to one's physical health.
Most of the people I know who never show any willingness or curiosity about their emotions, there's something inhuman about them, right? There's a time and a place for exploring emotions, and there's certainly a time and a place where you shouldn't go into it.
Should I go on? Abigail points out that Americans think they should always be happy in this day and age, and I actually do agree with this, but most modern-day therapies acknowledge that this isn't the goal and isn't healthy, and they focus on meaning-making over happiness, which you would know if you were actually trained in this stuff. She discusses something.
Right, so people who aren't particularly familiar with therapy think it's just all indulgence and massaging your feelings, when really it tends to focus on how you can find meaning in your life, and who's going to naysay that? Like, why is it bad to spend 50 minutes a week getting clarity on where your life has meaning?
Called action orientation versus state orientation. She says that the research on this topic has shown that action orientation is more beneficial during performance, but she kind of seems to be stretching the topic by implying that it has any benefits for emotionality, when in fact emotional clarity, meaning having clarity on how you're feeling, has been shown to have a curvy linear relationship with internalizing symptoms like depression and anxiety, with neuroticism as the moderator. In other words, putting too much of a focus on your feelings can definitely be taken to an extreme. It's healthiest to be mindful of your emotions in moderate doses, not in low doses like she seems to be suggesting. And
Right, if you're high in neuroticism, additional focus on your feelings is probably not a good thing. Neuroticism means that you tend to wallow in negative emotions.
There is nothing particularly extreme about asking somebody how they're feeling that day. Then she says bad therapy step 2 is to induce rumination. She says that people just end up venting in therapy, and then this just gets them in a cycle of ruminating, which actually makes their mental health worse. This is not a typical thing that happens in therapy. Are there therapists out there that do just let people vent? Yeah.
Ah, great. Holly says, hey, Luke, I'm on the Adderall too since I was 46, about 9 years. It makes a difference. Yeah, it can change your life. 95% of the ways that I would get into trouble and self-destruct get cured simply by taking my Adderall.
Yeah, I'm sure there are. But when Abigail says bad therapy, it seems like she's stretching it to mean most therapy. Because, in her words, Abigail Shrier argues that the problem isn't the kids, it's the mental health experts. She reveals that most of the therapeutic approaches have serious side effects and few proven benefits. Bad therapy step 3 is to make happiness a goal but reward emotional suffering. Again, Therapists do not do this. Bad therapy step 4 is to affirm and accommodate kids' worries. She gives the example of a therapist that gives a kid
Okay, Anna Uden, she's got a lot of great videos. Here is one I love on This Is Why You Are Not Popular.
Before I get into it, I think it might be tempting to see the title of this video and say, oh, it's stupid to want to be popular, that's superficial, you shouldn't care about those things. But when we think about what it means to be popular...
So this woman, she's Romanian, and her primary goal is to be a writer. She just published a novel, but she recognizes that it's highly unlikely she'll make a living as a novelist, so she got a degree in psychology. And she's 25 and she's married.
Popularity is kind of like an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of different psychological needs. It encompasses the need for belonging and acceptance in a group of people, the need for feeling validated as a person, feeling like you're good enough. It can also be more of like an ego thing, a desire for power. It can be a desire for social connection, for friendship, for not wanting to be lonely. And so most of these things are very normal things to want as a human being. And so if you want popularity as a way to get those things, I don't think that makes you superficial. I don't think it makes you a bad person. I just think it makes you a person. So without further ado, here it is. The thing that I think popular people usually have. The people who become popular are usually fun in one way or another. They're fun for other people to be around.
I think this woman's just got so much wisdom for a 25-year-old. I have consumed probably 10 hours of her videos since Sunday. And I think she's absolutely right. Popular people are fun people. And there's nothing about being popular or fun that makes you a good person. And there's nothing about being a good person and an empathic person that's going to make you fun or popular. So when I think back to my school days, the popular people were the fun people, the risk takers, and they were not necessarily the good people.
And I think if we're being honest, when we're not popular, it's because we're just not the most fun person in a room to interact with in a social setting. That doesn't mean that one-on-one we might not be perfectly fun to interact with.
Okay, let's bring
just means that in a
Mr. Elliott
social
Blatt
setting,
back to the show. Mr. Blatt, what's going on, bro?
Yeah, blessings. Yeah, how you doing? A quick one tonight, bro.
Okay.
So today, the weather broke. It's sunny and dry finally. It's sort of the beginning of a proper summer for me, and I just absolutely crushed it today. The sun was out. It was like having a double dose of Adderall.
Wow.
Now it finally made me understand, because I've been sort of just dragging ass all summer. It's been a really lousy summer, but my lungs felt great as I coughed, and I just had this huge to-do list, and I just knocked it out of the park today, bro. It felt good.
Oh man, way to go. Oh, anything that you attribute it to aside from the weather?
Well, no, actually, that's the situation as the boss, and with me, I'm just highly weather dependent. I've decided. Would you say that's true of you?
Well, I live in Los Angeles, where it's sunny 330 days of the year, so I don't know how weather dependent I am. I pretty much always lived in sunny places.
Too much sun can wear you out. Can totally wear you out, can burn you out, literally and figuratively.
Whoa, I lost you. But yeah, we lost Elliott, but I wear this big old hat that protects me from the sun, and I also put on sunscreen. But I love the sun. Try to use it intelligently, but sunshine, blue skies make me happy.
Innate strengths are not as compatible with what people need in order to become popular. And it might sound harsh, but I think this is something that we can work on. And again, I don't think it makes us a lesser friend or a lesser person. It's just you need to build certain strengths in order to be more fun in social settings. So I'm going to tell you exactly how to do that. Starting off with why popular people are often just fun people. Let's do a little exercise, okay? You can get out a pen and paper, or you can jot this down in the comments if you prefer. I want you to think of a social group to which you belong, and imagine that you're throwing a party.
Elliott Blatt.
Think about all the different people you might invite.
I was talking, and I realized with my ear, I'm on the phone. I must have clicked away. I don't know what was the last thing you heard.
I was asking, aside from the weather, anything else that resulted in a kick-ass day?
Yeah, well, it was the one blemish on today, which I want to talk about, which was I had to mail something today. I had to go to the post office.
Oh, yeah, that can really bring you down.
When was the last time you went to a post office?
Oh, it's been a long time, but I was not a happy camper when I did. In fact, I'd go up front when there's a long line and like bang on the glass and say, "Hey, we need some help out here."
Yeah. Yeah. So I got there. There's a line. There's like 10 people deep, and there's literally one person at the counter taking people, and they're not moving quickly, Luke. They're not moving quickly because they're just dragging their feet, doing one thing at a time, taking their sweet old time, totally, not cognizant of the frustrated hordes waiting to get their stuff mailed. So I went to one post office, and this was the situation. And what did I do? A, did I wait in line? Or B, did I seek other options?
I believe you sought other options.
I sought other options, Luke. I said, I'm going to go to a different post office. I'm going to go to a different post office. Right?
Yeah.
So I get my car and I go to the next post office I know about. Park the car, feed the meter, go in. Same situation. 10 people in line, one person at the counter. And I'm thinking, I'm noticing a pattern here. Did I wait in line or did I seek other options?
You sought other options.
I sought other options, Luke. So I got out. Turned out, got back in my car, drove. And I thought, where's the most obscure post office? I started really getting the noggin jogging, I'm thinking, I know where to go. There's this really out of the way post office. And so I go there. It's quite of a long drive, but it was sort of in the way I was going anyway, so it wasn't a big sacrifice. So I go to this post office. It's my third post office of the afternoon. I get in there. Nobody's there, Luke.
Yeah.
Nobody's there. I go right to the front, and I mail my item. But in the course of mailing my item, I had to send a book across country to Maryland. How much do you think it is to send a book to Maryland?
$6. I mean, you're doing it the cheapest way?
Well, okay. I was thinking, how I should have qualified. How much is it to send a book to Maryland first class?
Oh, first class, and it's less than £1?
It's probably around £2.
Oh, $24?
Yeah, it's more than I would have guessed. It's $20, Luke. And I was like, oh my God.
So you went to a lot of effort, and how much did you make on this transaction?
Well, hold on. Well, there is book rate. And I said, okay, book rate is like 2 weeks versus like 5 days.
Yeah.
So book rate was $6. And I said, you know what?
Send it book rate.
I'm sending it book rate. I'm sorry, you're going to have to wait 2 weeks, But I remember the days where you could buy a priority mail box, and whatever you could cram into that box, you could send coast to coast in 2 days for like $5. And basically my clock had stopped then, I just forgot about postage rates until today.
It used to be that you could hire a secretary and have sex with her, and it wasn't like a federal case. Times have changed.
I know. Times have changed. The situation is the boss, though. So
situation is the boss, bro.
Yeah. So anyway, I sent it book rate, but I realized is that it's actually quite a drag in the economy like this because postage costs used to be so trivial you didn't even consider it when you were buying something. But now, somehow when you buy something on Amazon, Amazon's so big that they've negotiated really cheap delivery costs. But if you're your own private operator and you have to use the post office, you don't get those deals. And so you're really at a disadvantage because you have to
I don't get why you had to stand in line. If I was sending a £2 book, I would have just put it in an envelope. I would have stamps, and I'd look up the postage, and I'd just put the stamps on the envelope, and then put it in the outgoing mail.
Well, that's what I've learned. I learned. This was my, I don't know the stove is hot until I put my hand on it, bro. And today was the day. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I'm gonna get a scale. I'm gonna go to stamps.com, and I'm gonna completely automate the situation. But
well, couldn't you just look up the book on Amazon and see how much it weighed, and then add a couple of ounces for packaging. And I mean, that's what I sold some books via Amazon, and that's what I did. I never waited in line, to the best of my knowledge. I would just look up the weight of the book on Amazon, add 2 ounces for the packaging, and mail it off.
Where'd you get the stamps?
I ordered them off the internet.
Okay, well, in retrospect, had I known all this stuff, I would have done the same. But now that I know, there's a way where you can open an account with the post office, and just get a postage bill and just pay your bill online, right? So it's just something I have to automate. But I never knew that it was really worth doing until today.
Yeah. Yeah, it's being vulnerable to other people that really tends to increase unhappiness. And so being vulnerable to long lines and poor service in post office, this is the whole reason that we have sentiments like going postal, because there are so many shooting incidents in post offices, because the service is typically so bad. It's a very common complaint that you just made.
Yeah, I know. And it's like comedians make jokes about this. But until it really bites you, you just kind of brush it off as being inconsequential. But you don't have 45 minutes in your day just to mail something, bro.
Oh, no.
Time marches on. You got to get stuff done, bro.
Yeah, no, that's a learning experience, though.
Yeah. So that was my learning experience of the day. So, but other than that, it was a kick-ass day. But every day, you can't see. You learn by doing, bro. You don't have to read peer-reviewed stuff. You have to just get in the real world and get your hands dirty and learn by experience. So,
and that's the attitude you'd like for the people who design and build your airplanes, right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. If you lose a few, it's okay.
Right, the people making the skyscraper where you work.
Your personal growth is what's important.
Yeah, just kind of go by intuition.
Yeah, just go to
like a 100-story skyscraper in San Francisco or Los Angeles or anywhere in California near the San Andreas. Just use your best intuition.
Just kind of estimate and see what happens, bro. You know that story, though. There's a giant tower here.
Yeah, and it's tipping a little bit more every year.
Yeah, it's tipping because another construction project kind of loosened the earth underneath, and it sort of subtly destabilized the foundation. So the amount of loss, the financial loss associated with this must be absolutely definite.
You'd think they'd use a lever, like get a couple of blokes, pushing on a lever to raise the building on the side where it's tilting, and then like shove some concrete blocks under there.
You'd think so. Maybe get some nice husky Aussies, to really get in there and
yeah, like put an iron bar under the tilted side of the building, and then just push down on the iron bar, raise the building, and then shove some iron blocks under there. Some bricks.
Or they could go to the other side of the building and start digging a little bit,
Oh yeah, that'd be good.
There's always options.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? Ugh, I don't know. I can't imagine being the guy responsible for that and all the shit they must be going through. Imagine the urge to pass the buck on that one.
Oh yeah. Hey, how often do you walk on the beach barefoot? So I've been doing that, but man, that's much more tiring than going for a regular walk.
Oh yeah, I used to do that quite a bit, less so recently. Do you remember years ago there's these shoes with the lower heel?
Yeah.
So the top of your foot was high, and then your heel was lower than the top of your foot.
Yeah.
And the woman that designed them, I think it was from South America, and she noticed that the natives of South America had perfect posture, and she'd attributed to them walking on the beach and having their heels sink down had the effect of correcting their posture. And so yeah, I've done it. It is very tiring. I'm really reluctant to walk barefoot now because there's little seashells and things that are sharp and you can cut your foot. So I'm not able to completely relax when walking on the beach barefoot. Does this afflict you?
I just go barefoot, bro. I'm I'm from Australia. That's
Okay.
how we
Well,
roll. I just crunch those seashells under my feet.
you don't care.
Imagine that they're liberal tears.
You got those stainless steel balls, just clanking through, crushing those seashells. Yeah, I like to walk on like the wet sand where it's just a little bit giving, not the dry sand where you really sink down.
Oh
Walking
yeah.
right, you know what I'm saying?
No, I definitely don't like the dry sand. That's way too tiring.
So, like, when I used to walk in the way, these were the days of Halsey on Worski. I used to listen to Halsey on Worski walking the beach. I was having a grand old time. Until my headphones got ripped off. Until my headphones got bipped. They got jacked out of the trunk of my car. So
do you use earpods or wired headphones?
Well, I had these headphones that were sort of sewn into a hat, to like a beanie hat,
Yeah.
It was $20 versus $200 for some earpods, So I was doing that, and they worked fine. Then I lost the first set I had. I put in the washing machine, ruined them.
I was afraid. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the second set were ripped off, so I've yet to go for the third set. So I'm on the. I've tried buying other cheaper off-brand headphones, but they don't quite work, and so I'm waiting for the opportune deal before I recommit the capital.
So I was afraid to lash out for, I don't know, these $120 earbuds from Apple. I was afraid to lash out because I heard so many stories about people losing them and other problems, losing their charge. But I've had these for a year. They've served me very well for a year.
That's great to hear, and I will
happy
eventually
customer.
do it. It's heartwarming, bro. Glad to hear it, and I'll consider it. But I'm like, I'm not the type that, like, lately I've been much more fiscally cautious.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been looking for ways to not spend money. And not only have I not been spending money, I've been selling possessions that I don't use, which has been it's been a great experience for me.
Yeah.
So basically, I've been like adding like $200 or $300 a month every month to my income, just by ditching something I don't use. And it's just like, wow, it feels great. Like, not only do you have to, like, that object is no longer your consciousness, but you have a little extra cash, It's sort of a double win.
Excellent.
So anyway, I'm getting much more aesthetic in my older age. I'm kind of enjoying it. It's very freeing. But maybe I'll make an exception for these earphones, because I am such a podcast consumer, as it were.
Yep.
All
Okay.
right. Well, that's all
Blessings.
I got, bro. It was quick.
Okay.
All right, peace.
Okay.
Blessings.
Take care. Okay. Just a little bit more from Anna Uden. I love this young woman.
And I want you to think about the one person that you'd really want to make sure is there at that party. And try to identify them in your mind's eye and really imagine them walking through the door, interacting with people, what they would bring to the party. Who's that one person that the party would be incomplete without? Now, some of you might have just pinpointed the person that you're most emotionally close with, that you're most comfortable with. But I'm willing to bet that many of you pinpointed the most fun person at a party. So for me, if I think about the social circle that I have in mind, the one person that I would say would be the best to have at the party is very high energy, a bit mischievous, free-spirited, talkative, life of the party, good conversationalist. Even though, honestly, they're not my favorite person. They're not somebody that I think has great morals. They're not somebody that I would trust to be very emotionally intimate with. But when it comes to popularity, when it comes to social settings and group settings, what matters is a person's level of fun. Because popularity has very little to do with one-on-one emotional connection. A person...
I mean, this is great stuff. I mean, a lot of wisdom for a 25-year-old. I want to know why you're not popular, you're not fun. But people who are fun and popular, not necessarily good. People who are good don't necessarily tend to be popular. People who are empathic don't tend to be popular. People who are popular, not necessarily empathic. People who are popular tend to be fun and take a lot of risks, often unnecessary risks.
could be very low on the social totem pole, but still have very fulfilling relationships, be a wonderful friend, be a great person to have on your side. And likewise, somebody could be popular and not really know how to get deep and how to get intimate with people. But remember, popularity is about what happens in groups, not one-on-one. So who